Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Riverdale. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I like that this episode has, I don't know if you consider, I think you kind of call it like a little horror thriller, like, template to it. Because it is this, like, you know, these three tales. Like, obviously, it's like, there's stories that have kind of used this template before, and I don't know where you would say the original template for this was, but it's interesting that Minerva's here for these paintings that, Cheryl has painted, and each one tells a story. It is kind of messed up that using, like, the people in her lives, like, pain and tragedy as artwork, and also because it's almost like a way to bring in your girlfriend and seduce her, the woman you're like related to, so that's why it's also a little, but, nevertheless, we kind of deal with everyone's respective situations. First, we start with Archie's story, where obviously he's talking to Dr. Winters about what he's seeing and what he's dealing with. Obviously, Bingo, and she's trying to help him basically, because he initially doesn't want to take pills because I guess he feels like there could always be side effects and just like you never know like how you would necessarily respond to medication. So I think for him, I think there's also, maybe you could read a little deeper into that and be a thing of like Archie wants to be able to do it on his own. He doesn't want assistance from medication. He wants to be able, because probably like, Archie's very strong-willed, and I think on some level maybe you could interpret that as maybe he thinks if I want to prove how strong I am by figuring this out on my own, like using my own strength to do this without needing medication. Which obviously it shouldn't be bad to medication shouldn't be like looked down. Like I'm not saying that's Archie's perspective, but I can feel like that could be his justification for it. Or it could just be like the whole, right, I don't know how it'll mix with my circumstances, but she tries to help him with a thing to basically follow her fingers. Basically, while you're talking about something traumatic, repeat it over and over again while following my fingers, because that way it'll keep you in the present. That way you're not kind of triggered and taken back. Like you're not kind of sitting and living in that memory. It's like reminding you that it is just that, it is the past, it is that trauma, but you're kind of living in the present. And it's not just Eric that's doing good. Archie is too. Granted, Eric is, he's on the medication. Cheryl shows up wanting to basically the palladium out of her mind before Hiram could get it. I was like, because she's like, yeah, basically something that people have known for weeks, and in some cases months before me, that there's a whole bunch of palladium. I'm like, how did you find out about that? I wonder who hooked you up with that information. So she's wants Andrew's construction to like mine it out. Archie's like, I'm not a miner. She's like, you're a soldier, a fighter, and you know, a teacher, a bounty hunter. Like it's not too much out of your purview. And it's like, all right, so get Reggie, Fang, Kevin involved as well, and all, you know, along with Frank and Eric, and start mining. And you could tell immediately. Well, first and foremost, I love the whole like, right, everyone hands around the circle, like, you know, Cheryl does her like praying thing, and so you could tell immediately Archie was hesitant about going inside of the mine, and but obviously there was a whole situation with Kevin going in there alone initially, and when he did go in there, it sent him, you know, his PTSD like kicked in again, and luckily they found palladium, but that just pushed Archie to think like, right, I do need to get better because so many people are counting on me. I think that's the thing about Archie too. He carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. Like once again, because he feels like so many people died, he's failed so many people. He tries to go above and beyond to be there. It's like, right, I need to be the one in charge, because he failed. Like he talks about later on, like he led a lot. It was not just Bingo. A lot of men under his command died, and so it is that thing of like, right, I got to have a steady hand. I have a steady mind when it comes to leading so many people. Like once again, it's not just this whole situation. So as a soldier, Archie's story just compounds upon itself just from the beginning to where he is now. I mean, Archie was already dealing with a lot even before he went off and became a soldier. Like I said, like he already had plenty of wounds and scars that had not completely healed, and he went off, you know, to war, and that, you know, added even more scars on top of what was already there. Before he could even heal what was already damaged, like there was more physical, mental damage done. And so they go back into the mines, and now he has the medication, but when he gets in there, he starts hallucinating. He see because I think it was Fang that told the story about the Mothman and stuff like that. But Archie's just kind of like, whatever, it's not real. But he starts hallucinating, and now he starts getting paranoid because he's like, I know what you're doing. You're experimenting on us. He like threatened the Dr. Winters and confronted her like that. And it's just like, oh, he does not. He kind of looks crazy. He's even talking to Eric, and it's just like, and Eric even says a lot of like, right. She's doing good for me and you, Sarge. I think you're really gonna, you're benefiting from her help. He's like, yeah, I mean, I'm surprised after everything, you out of anyone didn't get broken. But that's the thing of like, Archie's very good at hiding it. I think he has been broken for a long time, and I think he thought going off to being a soldier, he thought it would kind of fix what was there. It was just kind of him trying to slap a band-aid on the cracks, and I think those cracks have just gotten more and more and more and more as the time is going on, but even just his time in the military. And so, because I just think he wasn't in the right mind state to go into the military, because I think it just aggravated like the issues that were already there, because he, like I said, he had never solved the underlying issues. Like, he never really fully dealt with them, at least I don't feel like. So I think, just like I said, the military just like aggravated like the issues that he already had. Like, maybe things would be different if he had went into it being who he was, like before everything, before a lot of the series of Riverdale happened to him. Maybe Archie, when he was younger, like maybe the military would have been good for that Archie, but who he is right now, well, who he was before the time skip, I don't think it was a good match for him. But nevertheless, Archie decides to not to take the medication, but Frank is like, no, just, we think you should just kind of rest and stuff like that, do some of the billing and paperwork and stuff like that. But then Archie hears everyone else like screaming and losing their minds and mind, and I'm like, oh, I was like, so at first I was like, okay, there's something in that mind. I was like, maybe it has something to do with the palladium, like maybe it doesn't, like I was like, maybe it didn't mix well with his medication, or well then like why has it affected everyone else? I was like, it has to be, well, because it seems like everyone had episodes, but it seems like Archie and Eric had the most like physically like attacking, so that's why I'm thinking like the more like psychotic breaks, and I think it's probably because the maybe it's just generally the carbon monoxide poisoning, but I think their underlying issues plus the medication, like all of that was the rest, because like no one else had that same response. They were all freaking out and scared, but like they're the only ones that had that very specific response of kind of like lashing out and getting scary, so but yeah, it turns out this monoxide poisoning down there, which Cheryl's like, cool, get some canaries and then get back to work type of situation. It's like, okay. Because for her, this is her middle finger to Hiram before he can get to the palladium, because, I mean, that's why he wants to land in the first place. But aside from all of that, it's just like, his story is, well, his and Betty's are probably like the most unresolved at the end of this, which we'll get to Betty soon enough, but it is a thing of him trying to go back. He's trying to talk to Dr. Winters, and it's she's like, yeah, I mean, I'm scared like right now. I don't know if I should be the one to treat you, like, and if you're really hallucinating this badly, maybe you shouldn't be around other people too. So which I'm like, are you I mean, I think he probably needs like an actual, like, for me at first I was like, would a therapist really say that? Like, wouldn't she recommend like you actually talk to somebody? But I guess it's like, right, you probably get him like committed to a place for 72-hour observation or something like that. She didn't suggest that, but maybe that's something that's kind of talked about off screen. But I would assume that'd be something you'd like. It just seemed like she was just kind of like, I get it, but like it's not like she gave any like, okay, I'm gonna recommend you to some other specialist because I don't think I can help with what you're dealing with, because it's not just Bingo he's seeing anymore. It's everyone that's ever died under his command. So his conditioning is getting worse. Like maybe the pills, maybe the monoxide poisoning, just like it activated something that was already there, like underneath the surface. Like once again, those cracks got a little deeper and a little further because of all of that. I don't know. So, like I said, his story ends up being kind of leaving all very, like, unresolved, but I think it's just because it's a continuation of... it actually kind of fits, narratively speaking, the way, like... Because I talked about this with, like, Roswell, New Mexico, this week's episode, how it's kind of almost scattershot, the way it was kind of filmed. I think the same thing applies in Archie's, like, amongst any story... Because I feel like even with, I think you could say the same thing with Jughead's, and I think the same thing could apply to Betty's, but his felt the most scattershot, but I think it's it fits narratively speaking with the medication, hallucinations and stuff like that. So it kind of fit in that regard. So I found that fascinating. But so there's Archie's story. Then we have Betty's story, which she's trying to get information out of this guy. He immediately, upon seeing Polly, kind of figured, like, right, because he had heard stories about Betty, this rogue FBI agent looking for her sister. It's interesting because he made this whole point about, like, oh, like, if I help you, you're going to be like every woman that kind of, like, uses me and tosses me aside, which I'm like, okay, so get ready for your psychological, stereotypical psychopath checklist. I'm like, okay, yeah, because at first I was like, oh, he seems very anti-woman, like he hates women, but it's just like he's like almost like all women use you and manipulate you. I'm like, okay, first thing on the list, does he have what's your relationship with your mother? And I'm like, because that feels like your cliche psychopath thing of like, all right, that seems like that might stem from some other issues. Maybe not, but that's usually the go-to. At least I feel like most things depict that being like the go-to of like why a psychopath does what they do. Because on some level, it's like, it's because of mommy issues, you know. So I don't know. It just seemed, like I said, it came off very like woman hating, but then like he also talks about like his family hunting, because it seems like he looks at people as not people. He looks at them as animals, as prey, something to be hunted down. And I'm wondering, is it because, you know, maybe diving a little deeper into his psychology, maybe it's because in his own personal life he felt like being prey and he doesn't want to be prey anymore. So maybe his family was kind of like that and they found another avenue. Like maybe it's kind of like, oh, we prey on you till you get strong and then we go out and we hunt people, because it sounds like that's what they do. Because it doesn't seem like he's just the only hunter in his family. Like, it sounds like his family does as well. At first, you could immediately take that as, like, well, maybe he means that literally as, like, they hunt, like, animals and stuff like that. But maybe he kind of pulled a bit of a Dexter where it's like, oh, killing animals isn't enough. I need to find another route for my psychopathic tendencies. So, like, I need to take all of that into a different direction. So, ultimately, no matter what Betty does, she can't get him to open up about what he's done, because it's like she needs to know about Polly. You know, if Polly is in fact dead, like they found her blood and everything in the phone booth, but it's like we need to know where her body is and everything. We need some form of closure, but he won't give them the answers they need. So Betty goes to her mom. It's like, if you can talk to him and talk about your daughter, you can talk about Polly. Like, you can humanize her in his eyes, and it might open him up a little bit more. So I know, interestingly enough, Matt Shinomic, she actually directed this episode, which I was like, oh, I wonder how she, like, once again, I take notice of it. Sometimes I just don't always pay attention. I don't always remember to, like, point that out, because I usually kind of, like, gloss over that sometimes, but I always think it's so really interesting when the actors in their shows, like, get an opportunity to direct. Like, I'm not saying this is even her first time. She might have directed other episodes too, but I just happened to notice it this episode. I was like, oh, that's pretty dope. Alice ends up, you know, trying to appeal to him to be like, hey, this is my my daughter, you know. And at first he kind of is like, oh, like, he's like, your daughter, she squealed like a pig when I slit her throat. And Alice proceeded to punch him in the face. It's also, first and foremost, he's kind of getting it twisted about what family you mess with. Not the family you should get, like, twisted about who they are, considering everything that family's been through, kind of the darkness that runs in that family. Not just in Betty, not just in Charlie, no, it's Charles, but, you know, also in, that darkness is in Alice as well. But, even to the point, it's like, Betty's like, well, we're gonna have to find some other way to appeal, like, try to get to him. And Alice is like, you can kill him. That man deserves to die. As your mother, I give you permission. I was like, wow. It's like, that man killed my daughter. It's like, Mom, it's not going to make you feel any better. It's like, well, I will feel better knowing, I will feel on some level better about knowing that the man that killed my daughter is dead. So, you can do it. So, initially, she wanted to at least just try to scare him into believing, like, all right, I will kill you. Like, if he feels he's in danger, then maybe, just maybe, he'll confess. But at first, Betty was like kind of scaring him, like, oh, I'm gonna cut off your feet with a chainsaw and I'm gonna cauterize it, and then I'm gonna keep going up, and then I get to your groin area, then I'm gonna get to your hands. And so she's saying all this stuff, and I was also about to say, like, too, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, Betty's got a really dark side, so I was like, I could definitely see that being a possibility. I hope she doesn't actually go through with it, but I don't know whether he didn't really believe her or not. because he ended up bringing up like, oh, did your sister go by the name Patty? Does she have this specific tattoo? Did she have blue eyes? And he's like, yeah. And it's like, yeah, but I don't remember a thing about her. Like, that's the thing. Like, he's a psychopath. He was never, you could never trust anything that comes out of his mouth. Hell, he even had Betty digging up a so-called body, but it ended up being like dog bones or whatever. He was just toying with her. Like, there was never going to be, you could never trust anything that came out of his mouth. Even if he said like, oh, he did kill Polly, can you ever truly be certain about it? I mean, it seems a possibility, but it's just like, she might actually be alive and he might have just been toying with the entire... You never know. And so we end up finding out all the stuff that was said to her was actually stuff that TBK said to her. Those exact words. So that's where it's like, oh, I thought she freestyled it. It's like, nah, she plagiarized that. Which I guess to some extent is kind of good, because that meant she had to tap into a psychopath to say that. It wasn't just something she would, like I said, she was freestyling, so it makes it a little better. She was about to come back with the chainsaw, but when she came back, he was dead. I was like, oh, did someone come there to kill him? But it's like, no. We find out he bit his tongue and choked on it. When he bit his tongue off and choked on it and died. Which Alice feels no sympathy. Like, once again, them being cold-hearted, being like, well, at the end of the day, we're back to square one. We're like no closer with the whole Polly thing. And it's like, but at the very least, that psycho's dead. So there's some future women that could have potentially been future victims, are safe from this. So like, they have no remorse about it, And even Betty asking like, do you feel better? He's like, yeah, I actually do. Because she's like, Alice believes that they did some good by removing him from the board. And even Betty just taking a swig and being like, but the whole thing about his family, like, there might be a family of hunters and stuff like that. Which I find, like, the moment that statement was said, I was like, that's ironic, considering, like, both of your very cold reactions to this. Because also, like, the coroner got the body and stuff like that, but I'm like, home dude can be paid off to, like, say, like, that's why I'm like, because I was also like, how do you explain that away? It's like, well, you have ways of covering that stuff up. It wouldn't be the first time that household has covered some things up, so it's not too, like, outlandish. But it's just like the cold nature of them, and I think probably even Betty dealing with that of like, right, did he do it because he felt guilty about what he did, or was it just because he was scared of what Betty actually could do and would do? Because when he looked at her, did he see a darkness even deeper than his own? Did it terrify him, or was it just his middle finger to Betty and Alice? Because like, right, with me dead, like, what? I'm not even going to give you the opportunity to try and torture the information. I'd rather die with you never knowing for sure. Maybe self-preservation to his family if they are involved. So we'll ultimately have to wait and see where things kind of go on that front. But then finally we get Jughead's story. And the moment like his story starts and he's kind of in like a meeting, I'm like, doesn't this sound like his Riverdale High School? I was like, oh, maybe it's someone else. Because like last time we saw Jughead, I like that we just kind of like left that up there. Like, oh, what's that? Oh, no, Jughead was fine. So basically, he kind of tells a story of kind of what happened. His story, going off to Iowa, college wasn't what he thought it'd be. I guess because of all the excitement that was Riverdale, plus also where a lot of stuff ended between him and his squad. Like, him, Betty, Veronica, and Archie, like where things kind of stood. Like, I'm sure that kind of left a bad taste in his mouth, but also it's just like, Iowa wasn't the place he thought it was going to... that Iowa college wasn't what he thought it was going to be. And so he's kind of bored, and he started writing and drinking. And that's kind of where that starts. And he ended up sending that off to someone in New York that ended up eventually becoming his agent, Sam. And so, obviously, he met Jess, and they began their thing of drinking and fighting. And it's just like, there's a lot of things that contributed to... Jughead's circumstances, but that's when he like first did those maple mushrooms, and he wrote the story, and his agent was like, Sam was like, oh, this is gonna be a YA hit, which means the moolah's gonna come rolling in, and he's so excited. There's a party gonna be held, and well, he had even called Betty earlier in the episode about having an agent, and I was like, oh, so you and Betty were still decently in good terms. It wasn't until that message, as well as the book, that really like put a nail in that coffin of that. Because I'm assuming, and I could be mistaken, I'm curious like what was the reason why Betty couldn't come, because it's probably like, I don't know how much because that conversation hasn't really come up, because when you actually break it down and think about it, they haven't really talked like that. Once again, every character is off with their own story, and they're not really connecting or talking about everything. So none of them really know about what Archie's going through, because he's not talked about it. Betty's got her own PTSD, so does Jughead. So, because the thing is, like, no one in that group is really talking, because even Veronica's keeping secrets about what she's up to right now. It's for legal reasons, but still, like, she's not even telling Archie what she was, like, up to. So it's like, that group, like, the bonds they had are broken, and, you know, those 7 years apart, it's really hard to put them back together, especially how things were left off. Like, it seemed like, oh, maybe they were going to be okay, but that time apart and never coming back until 7 years later, like, didn't do them any favors. It made it that much harder to reconnect. So their story, it fits. Like, I think I brought that up last episode, just how narratively speaking their stories are they're somewhat connected in certain regards, but it's almost shallow connections. It's not the deep connections that they kind of were at one point in time. But my thought was, like, maybe the reason why Betty didn't show up at, like, his party or whatever is because of everything with, like, TBK. Like, she was dealing with that at the time, and Jughead probably still doesn't know that that's what she was dealing with, potentially. I mean, she didn't know what he was kind of going through either. But because, like I said, they were still on talking and good enough talking terms that it's like, right, he called her about being an agent. It's like, even when he was dating Jess, he was still texting, like, Betty. He was holding on to his past and couldn't let go. But it's not until she didn't show up and he sent the voicemail we heard the other episode, and it's like, that's when things were nasty. And Jughead talks about, you know, he walked into the darkness. I was like, oh, you mean that just metaphorically? He was like, no, I both mean that, well, metaphorically and literally, because at that point I disappeared, woke up in St. Vincent Hospital. Jess was there to tell me, like, I'd been gone for a couple days, and he didn't want to know what was going on. But, you know, coming back to Riverdale, if it, you know, like, obviously writer's block, stressing about everything, and Archie, you know, calling him, set everything in motion. But since coming back to Riverdale, it's not like anything got fixed. He's actually gotten worse because he's continued drinking and things aren't good. So he obviously came back to New York because he needed answers. Well, so once again, it shows like, oh yeah, the truck driver ended up just being a legit truck driver. It ended up being nothing sinister. They left it like that to make you go, oh, because we haven't heard anything from Jughead. It's like, no, he was fine. And so, in fact, he made his way back to Riverdale after all this. But he got his reports, and he was like, apparently he was had rabies and stuff like that. It's like, wait, I have rabies? Like, Jess, what was that all about? Apparently when he got brought in, he was out of his mind, talking about a rat king or something. So apparently when he disappeared on his way to his party, because he never actually showed up, he fell into a sinkhole, and then he met the rat king, but then it ended up being like his agent Sam manifested. It was like, oh, so this is like all in your delirious mind. And he's down there, and then lo and behold, who was the one that manifested to come and save him? Betty. He's like, and he talks about it, he's like, time and time again, Betty helped pull me out of that darkness that I've been in, you know, time and time again. Like, she just ended up being my savior, because they flood those, I guess, like, to clean them out, like, every so often, which I never knew. I guess that's a real thing. I never knew that. But it's like, right, Jughead, you need to get out of here, because if you don't, you'll drown and you'll die. And so he did, and he managed to stumble his way towards the light and found his way out, and that's when the police found him and took him to the hospital. Now, with this information, he decided to kind of confront his past. Like, he needed to face his trauma, so he went to the sinkhole, which now has been paved up, and he found where he exited, and he went down there, and now he gets the context of, like, right, he's like, where did I come up with the Rat King? It's like there's a stuff spray painted on the walls saying, like, oh, beware the Rat King. Like, in his delirium, he probably saw that and created this whole, like, thing in his subconscious, in his head, to deal with everything. Because it turns out the reality of it, like, this is where he was. He found his stuff. He even found the book that he was reading to the quote-unquote Rat King. But then he looks through it and kind of sees, like, he had scribbled some stuff in his, like, mania. It turns out when he fell down there, he, like, basically all of that was in his subconscious, because the rat stuff came about because there was a whole bunch of rats that covered him, and he was so afraid of, like, opening his mouth and screaming for help, because he didn't know if one of them would crawl in his mouth. So he was kind of stuck like that for a while, and all of that, his mind swirling and his subconscious creating something as kind of a defense of, like, his trying to his way of processing and dealing with the reality he was being presented with. So And the real kicker for Jughead is, at the end of the day, it made him realize how alone he is. Because no one came looking for him. No one, like, who did I have in my life? I had no one. I just had me. Because it's like, him and his friends weren't in tight spot. Like, hell, like, the one connection he still had was Betty, and he'd kind of pissed her off, like, saying that all that terrible stuff, which even he recognized, like, right, I said all that terrible, toxic stuff to her I shouldn't have said. So... And it's like, he didn't really, like, Jess wasn't really, like, the best girlfriend. Like, they weren't good for each, not just on, it wasn't just on her, it's just they weren't good for each other. They brought out the worst in each other. And so, in that, like, he realized, like, I have no one, like, I had no real friends in New York, like, no one who really cared about me. I'm a means to an end for something. Like, Sam, it's like, Sam only cares about me because I'm a bottom line for him. I'm a means of, like, yeah, like, I'm a check for him, essentially. So... And all his connections were back in Riverdale. So I was like, right, I'm in a place that, I mean, even all the connections I had to Riverdale were severed because of my book, and just the fact is, I hadn't communicated with people in like 7 years. Like, so it made him realize how alone he is. So he's back now trying to get his drinking under control because he's trying to pick up the shambles of his life. But first, it starts with getting his drinking fixed and, you know, dealing with the reality of, like, man, I am all alone. So... I'm curious, like, how that's going to correlate with him, you know, sobering himself up, and, you know, what does that mean for him and Betty? Like, I think maybe Jughead might be the means of kind of repairing that group. Like, he might be the one, like, in his process of healing and recovering and everything, that he might try and piece the group back together, because, you know, it's like, right, I realized I was alone and kind of coming to terms with that, and it's like, now that you are aware of that, like, what are you going to do about it? Now that you're more aware of wanting to get help for your issues, now that you were able to confront your past, which, you know, Archie's struggling with that now, maybe Jughead, you know, as his best friend, as his brother, could help him in that regard. Like, maybe they can help each other. I'm also curious, like, where this will go with the whole Mothman thing. It's still a background thing that we haven't really dealt with. I still feel like it was, like, government experiments that led to all of that. Like, that's what the Mothman are, but we haven't really touched that for a while, so we'll have to wait and see. But like I said, like, everyone's stories were kind of left a little open-ended, but I think it's just because we're going to get the continuation of those stories. Not necessarily in the same manners, but more so, like, in some shape or form, these stories will continue as these characters, like, grow across their arcs, as their arcs continue going forward for the rest of the season in the show. But we did have, like, the whole Minerva and Cheryl thing at the end of it all, which I love. The whole, you know, it's like, right, your grandmother, your Nana Rose tried to sacrifice me to an Eldritch Terror. I was like, oh, right. I mean, it's like, well, we already dealt with the Eldritch Terrors in Sabrina, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I was like, oh, it's like, because it's like, they could have picked anything, but they chose the Eldritch, like, Terrors specifically, and that's a major plot point in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, so, like, had to be on some level wink and nod in that direction. I like to believe so. It could just been like, well, that's just the particular thing they just happened to worship that day. Ended up, like, you know, that whole thing. But Minerva is going, like, wasn't it like she's going to, like, she's going out of country for, like, an art thing, but, you know, Cheryl's like, yeah, but we still have tonight at the very least. So ends off on kind of a happy note for them, kind of a depressing note for everyone else in certain regards. So I just thought that was interesting. Once again, just like the fact is that Cheryl's painting these stories of all these people she knows, and the three particular stories. I'm sure there were other stories, but these ended up being the, like, main ones. But and then it's just kind of like her story, which that's a whole can of worms in itself. But I guess because she's on her path of recovery because of the ministry and everything, like, that's kind of fixing that. Like, she's finding her own way through that. I mean, everyone's finding their own way through all of this, you know. That's what I think. That's kind of the point. How the direction the story is going is like I said, everyone kind of stumbling and fumbling their way through trying to figure out fixing themselves and dealing with themselves. Like, obviously, like, Kevin, you know, with his whole situation with Fang, but also, like, you know, joining, like, the ministry with Cheryl at the church and everything. So just a lot of really interesting things. I'm curious to ultimately see where next episode takes us with all of this. I saw a glimpse of next week's episode, not too much. I won't spoil it for anyone that doesn't want to know. But there is a certain reunion we're getting next episode, which I'm like, oh, that's fascinating in so many regards, because I was like, that's a reunion. That's something that hasn't existed for years in this show, and we're bringing it back. I was like, oh, that's going to be interesting to see how that's affected with the time skip and everything, and, like, what is happening, because there's other stuff to this continuity we don't know we'll get into it more when the next episode airs. But yeah, till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.